quiet suburban home, a seemingly perfect family, and a betrayal so twisted it leads to bloodshed. It all started with a secret one that should have never been uncovered. Richard Carter was a respected businessman, a devoted husband, and a father who had given his son, Daniel, everything. He raised him with discipline, provided him with the best education, and ensured he had every opportunity to succeed. But love, desire, and deception have a way of creeping into the most unsuspecting places, turning homes into battlegrounds. And when Richard stumbled upon something that shattered the very foundation of his world, he didn't just feel anger, he felt pure, uncontrollable rage. His wife Claire, the woman he had trusted with his heart, was not the person he thought she was. And his son, his own flesh and blood, had committed the ultimate betrayal. The Carters had always presented themselves as the picture-perfect family, well-mannered, financially stable, and admired in their community. But behind closed doors, the truth was much darker. Claire, young and beautiful, was Richard's second wife, a woman much younger than him, and Daniel's stepmother. To the world, she was the elegant, doting wife who had stepped into the role of caregiver effortlessly. But inside that house, secrets whispered between walls, glances held for too long, and tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Richard had noticed small things, a touch that lingered, a laugh that felt too intimate, stolen moments when they thought no one was watching. At first, he dismissed it. Maybe he was overthinking. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But as the pieces slowly started falling into place, doubt turned into suspicion, and suspicion became a horrifying reality. The night it all unraveled was like any other until it wasn't. Richard had come home early, stepping into a house that felt different. The air was heavy, the silence too loud, and then a sound of faint rustle upstairs. His heart pounded as he walked toward the bedroom, each step bringing him closer to a nightmare he never could have imagined. The door was slightly open, just enough for him to see the truth laid bare before his eyes. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. Betrayal, disgust, fury. He saw red, and when the dust finally settled, the life they had all built was drenched in blood. But what exactly happened that night? What drove a father to commit the unthinkable? And was this really just a crime of passion, or was there something even more sinister lurking beneath the surface? Stay with me, because this story is far from over. In the days leading up to that fateful night, Richard Carter had been restless. Something wasn't sitting right with him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. At work, he found himself distracted, staring blankly at emails, and zoning out in meetings. He told himself he was just stressed, that running a successful business came with its own pressures. But deep down, an unease had begun to settle, a gnawing sensation that something was happening right under his nose. It was Claire. She had been acting differently. More distant at times, yet oddly affectionate when he least expected it, as if trying too hard to maintain a sense of normalcy. And Daniel, his son, had always been ambitious, focused on his future, yet lately his demeanor had shifted. He was more confident, almost smug, walking around the house, as if he knew something Richard didn't. There were hushed conversations that stopped the moment Richard entered the room, exchanged looks that lingered too long, and an undeniable tension that thickened by the day. Richard's suspicions weren't baseless. A week before the murder, he had come home late from a business dinner and found Claire's car missing. It was well past midnight, and she had told him earlier she was exhausted, planning to go to bed early. He checked his phone, no missed calls, no texts explaining where she had gone. Maybe she had simply gone for a drive, needed fresh air. But when she finally returned an hour later, her excuse was thin, her words carefully measured. "I couldn't sleep, so I just took a drive down to the lake," she had said with a small, almost rehearsed smile. But Richard knew her too well. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she set her purse down, her perfume heavier than usual, as if she had tried to cover something up. He didn't press her then, but that feeling of unease burrowed deeper, keeping him awake long after she had slipped into bed beside him. And then there was Daniel. His son had always been driven, focused on building his own future, rarely involving himself in household drama. But Richard had started noticing a shift in newfound confidence in the way Daniel spoke to him, a boldness that bordered on arrogance. He had even caught Daniel sneaking glances at Claire in ways that made his stomach turn. But he had pushed the thought away, unwilling to entertain such a disgusting possibility. Perhaps it was simply his own paranoia, the stress of marriage, business, and fatherhood intertwining to play cruel tricks on his mind. But the signs were all there, waiting for him to piece them together. Then came the phone call. 2 nights before the murder, Richard's longtime friend and business partner, Michael, had called him out of the blue, his voice tight with urgency. "Rich, I need to tell you something. I don't know if it's my place," but he hesitated, clearly torn. "I saw something. Claire, she wasn't alone." Richard felt his stomach lurch. He didn't want to hear it, yet he couldn't stop himself from pressing further. Where? With who? The silence on the other end of the line stretched for too long. Then, finally, Michael sighed. "I don't know for sure, but it didn't look good." He mentioned a bar just outside of town, a place Richard never would have expected Claire to go. And that was enough to send Richard spiraling. He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he watched. He observed the way Claire seemed nervous around him, how Daniel had started coming home later than usual, his explanations vague and dismissive. The web of deception was tightening, and Richard felt trapped inside it. But Claire and Daniel weren't the only ones acting suspiciously. The family housekeeper, Maria, had been unusually tense as well, avoiding Richard's gaze whenever she served his morning coffee, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her apron. She had been working for the Carters for over a decade, loyal, dependable, the kind of woman who had seen and heard more than she let on. And lately, it was as if she was carrying a burden too heavy to bear. More than once, Richard had caught her staring at Claire and Daniel with something unreadable in her eyes, as if she knew a secret she wished she didn't. But every time Richard attempted to probe, she quickly deflected, muttering something about needing to tend to her chores. The night before the murder, Richard had made a decision. He would find out the truth, no matter what it took. He couldn't ignore the warning signs anymore, couldn't keep dismissing the feeling clawing at his gut. So he did something he never thought he would. He searched Claire's phone, Daniel's room, anything that might give him clarity. And what he found shattered him in ways he never imagined. There, hidden in the depths of Daniel's closet, was the proof he had been dreading. His heart pounded as he stared at the undeniable evidence before him. His hands clenched into fists, his vision blurred with rage, betrayal sinking into his bones. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Richard Carter was no longer the same man. Something had changed inside him, and when the night finally fell, blood would be spilled. But was this really just about betrayal? Or was there something much darker, lurking beneath the surface, something no one had seen coming? The truth was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Richard Carter thought he had found the truth, or at least enough of it, to justify the rage burning inside him. But just when he was ready to confront the people who had torn his world apart, something unexpected happened. The evidence what he had discovered in Daniel's closet was gone. He knew he hadn't imagined it. He had held it in his hands, felt the weight of it, the undeniable proof of his worst fears. But when he returned later that evening, desperate to examine it again, the space where it had been was empty. His stomach twisted as he searched frantically, pulling clothes off hangers, tearing through drawers. Nothing. It was as if it had never been there at all. Someone had taken it, and that meant one thing: they knew he was onto them. Panic tightened its grip on his chest. Had Claire discovered his snooping? Had Daniel? The idea of either of them watching his every move made his skin crawl. He needed to be careful. He needed to act normal, at least until he figured out who had erased the evidence and why. He forced himself to go about his evening routine, sitting through an excruciatingly tense dinner with Claire and Daniel, pretending everything was fine. But beneath the surface, his mind raced. Every movement, every glance they exchanged, felt like a code he couldn't crack. And then, just as he was beginning to drown in his thoughts, something else happened, something that made his blood run cold. A note slipped under his office door while he was upstairs. No signature, no indication of who had left it. Just 6 words, scrawled in hurried, uneven handwriting. "Stop looking or you'll regret it." Richard stared at the paper, his hands shaking. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was bigger. Someone was trying to silence him. But who? Claire? Daniel? Or was there someone else, someone he hadn't even considered yet? He thought about Maria, the housekeeper. Had she seen something? Was she trying to protect him, or was she involved in this twisted deception? His mind was spinning, but one thing was clear. Someone in that house didn't want him uncovering the truth. The next morning, Richard decided to test the waters. He casually mentioned to Claire that he had misplaced an important document in Daniel's room and asked if she had been in there. She didn't flinch. "Why would I go into Daniel's room?" she asked, stirring her coffee with perfect indifference. But Richard noticed something. Her grip on the spoon had tightened just slightly. Her jaw tensed for half a second before she forced herself to relax. She was lying. He knew it. But before he could press further, Daniel entered the kitchen, his usual confidence replaced by something else: unease. He avoided Richard's gaze, murmuring something about having plans, and left without finishing his breakfast. That wasn't like him. Something was happening. The walls were closing in, and Richard felt like he was running out of time. That night, unable to sleep, he stepped outside for some air. The backyard was quiet, the cool night breeze doing little to calm his nerves. But as he stood there, staring into the darkness, he felt it. Someone was watching him. He turned sharply, scanning the shadows. Nothing. But the feeling lingered, crawling up his spine like a warning. He wasn't just imagining things. Someone had been there. And then, the past came rushing back. A memory, long buried, resurfacing with brutal clarity. Years ago, before Claire, before this new life he had built, Richard had been involved in something he had spent years trying to forget. A betrayal of his own. It had nothing to do with Claire or Daniel, and yet somehow it felt connected. Could this be about more than just an affair? Could someone be using his own sins against him? The thought was terrifying, because if that was the case, this wasn't just about revenge. This was about punishment. And Richard had no idea who was pulling the strings. But he was about to find out whether he was ready for the truth or not. That night, sleep didn't come for Richard Carter. The warning note, the missing evidence, the unsettling memory of his own past, it all tangled together, forming a knot of paranoia he couldn't shake. But as he sat alone in his dimly lit office, running through every possible scenario in his head, something happened that made his blood turn to ice. His phone vibrated against the desk. A text. But it wasn't from Claire, Daniel, or anyone he knew. The number was blocked. And the message was chillingly simple: "You think you know the truth. You don't." Richard's fingers trembled as he gripped the phone. Someone was playing games with him, taunting him, pulling him deeper into this nightmare. But before he could process it, his phone vibrated again. Another message, this time with an image attached. He hesitated, his pulse hammering against his ribs as he tapped to open it. It was a photo, grainy, slightly blurred, but unmistakable. A shot of his house, taken from a distance. And at the very edge of the frame, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. Someone was watching. Someone was close. He bolted up from his chair, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps as he yanked open the blinds and scanned the darkness outside. But the street was empty. No movement. No sign of anyone lingering nearby. And yet, he could feel it, that same suffocating presence he had felt the night before in the backyard. Whoever this was, they weren't just toying with him. They were waiting for something, and that terrified him more than anything. Before he could decide what to do next, his phone rang. This time, it was an actual number. Michael, his business partner, the same man who had warned him about Claire. Richard hesitated before answering, his voice tight. "Michael, now's not a good time," but Michael cut him off, his tone urgent, almost frantic. "Rich, listen to me. I got one too." Richard's stomach dropped. "One what?" A pause. Then Michael's voice lowered, as if he was afraid someone might be listening. "A message. A photo. Of my house." Richard felt the walls close in around him. This wasn't just about his family anymore. Someone was pulling strings beyond what he had imagined. Someone who wanted to make sure he wasn't the only one drowning in fear. But why Michael? Why now? He hadn't been involved in Richard's personal life, at least. Not directly. Unless this wasn't about Claire and Daniel at all. Unless it was about something much bigger. Michael's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "I don't know what the hell is going on, but I think we need to talk. In person. Away from our homes." Richard gritted his teeth, his mind racing. Meeting Michael could be a trap, but staying in that house felt just as dangerous. He agreed, setting a time and place, his gut telling him that whatever answers Michael had, they weren't going to bring any comfort. But before Richard could even process the next step, Claire's voice rang out from the hallway. "Richard?" She sounded half asleep, her tone laced with confusion. He turned, quickly pocketing his phone as she appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "What are you doing up?" she asked, her gaze flicking toward the slightly open blinds, the faint glow of his laptop screen. For a brief moment, Richard considered telling her, laying it all out, demanding answers. But then he saw it, the flicker of something in her expression. Not concern. Not exhaustion. Something closer to calculation. And just like that, he knew. Claire wasn't just part of the problem. She was hiding something. Maybe everything. But before he could say a word, Claire tilted her head, watching him carefully. And then, in the softest, most deliberate voice, she asked a question that sent a chill straight through his spine. "Richard, have you ever kept secrets from me?" And just like that, the game changed again. Because now, Richard wasn't sure who was hunting who. Richard Carter had always been a man who prided himself on control. In business, in marriage, in life, he believed that as long as he stayed sharp, stayed ahead, he could keep everything in order. But now, standing in the dim glow of his office, staring into Claire's unreadable expression, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Powerless. Her question lingered in the air, like a heavy fog. "Have you ever kept secrets from me?" The way she said it calm, almost knowing, sent a slow, crawling unease through his chest. Was this a challenge? A warning? He forced a chuckle, trying to sound casual. "Everyone keeps secrets, Claire. Even you." He watched closely, searching for a reaction. But she only smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't warm or loving, but polite. Controlled. "Go to bed, Richard," she murmured, turning away before he could say anything else. Just like that, the conversation was over. But Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat awake in the darkness, his mind racing. The missing evidence, the messages, the photo of his house. Someone was watching him, playing with him. And now, Claire was acting like she knew something he didn't. He felt like a man walking through a minefield, every step more uncertain than the last. By morning, things only got worse. Richard had planned to meet Michael later that evening, to figure out who else was being dragged into this twisted game. But when he tried calling him, the line went straight to voicemail. Again and again. Something was wrong. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach as he grabbed his keys and drove straight to Michael's house. The moment he pulled up to the curb, he knew something was off. Michael's car was still in the driveway, but the front door was slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. Richard's pulse spiked. He stepped out of his car cautiously, scanning the quiet street before making his way up the path. "Michael?" he called, pushing the door open further. Silence. The house was eerily still, the air thick with something Richard couldn't quite place. The kitchen lights were on, a half-empty cup of coffee sitting on the counter, still warm. A newspaper lay open on the table, untouched. Michael had been here, and then he hadn't. Richard moved through the house slowly, his breath shallow. The place was undisturbed. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. Just emptiness. And then he saw it. A single sheet of paper placed neatly on the desk in Michael's study. His name, Richard Carter, written in bold black ink. No message, no explanation. Just his name, as if someone had left it there specifically for him to find. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in around him. Someone had taken Michael. Or worse. And now they were letting Richard know that he was next. A cold sweat broke out across his skin as he backed away, his heartbeat slamming against his ribs. He needed to leave. Now, he turned sharply, heading for the door, but just as he reached for the handle, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out with shaky hands, already knowing it wouldn't be good. Unknown number. One new message. He swallowed hard and tapped to open it. "You should have stopped looking." A shiver ran down his spine. He turned, scanning the street outside through the narrow crack of the open door. The houses across the street looked the same as always. The trees swayed gently in the morning breeze. Everything was normal. Too normal. But someone was out there. Watching. Waiting. Richard's breathing was ragged as he forced himself to move, stepping outside and locking the door behind him, even though he knew it was pointless. Michael was gone. And now, Richard was the only loose end left. He needed to figure out who was behind this fast. Because whoever they weren't just trying to scare him anymore. They were hunting him. And if he wasn't careful, he wouldn't be alive long enough to find out why. Richard Carter had always thought he was the one uncovering the truth, peeling back the layers of deception surrounding him. But as he sat in his car outside Michael's empty house, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled tension, a horrifying realization crept in. What if he wasn't the one in control of this mystery at all? What if someone else had been leading him exactly where they wanted him to go? The thought sent a chill through his spine, but before he could dwell on it, his phone buzzed again. Another message. His breath caught in his throat as he read it. "You've been looking in the wrong direction." A rush of panic and confusion slammed into him. He had spent days believing this was about Claire, about Daniel, about the affair that had shattered his marriage. But now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure. The warning didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like a correction. Like someone was trying to steer him away from his own false conclusions. And then, just as his mind started racing through the possibilities, his phone rang. The number was familiar. Too familiar. His own house. Claire. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him not to answer. But his fingers moved on their own, bringing the phone to his ear. "Claire?" His voice was barely more than a whisper. But what he heard on the other end wasn't her voice. It wasn't even breathing. It was silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. And then, just as he was about to hang up, a sound. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. A chair scraping against the floor. Someone was in his house. His pulse roared in his ears as he slammed the car into gear and sped toward home, his tires screeching against the pavement. The drive felt endless. his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and worst-case scenarios. When he finally pulled into the driveway, the front door was slightly ajar, just like Michael's had been. He had seen this before, but this time it wasn't happening to someone else. It was happening to him. He stepped inside cautiously, his breath uneven. The house was dim, the air heavy with the scent of something metallic, something that sent a deep primal fear crawling through his chest. Blood. He moved forward slowly, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. And then he saw it. A figure slumped against the kitchen counter, motionless. Claire. For a moment, time stopped. The betrayal, the suspicion, the games they had played against each other, none of it mattered now. He rushed to her side, his hands shaking as he touched her shoulder, turning her slightly. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, her breathing shallow. "Richard," she gasped, her voice barely there. His stomach clenched at the sight of her pale, weak, but alive. He tried to steady his voice. "Who did this to you?" Claire's lips parted, struggling to form words. But before she could speak, a shadow moved behind them. Richard barely had time to react before he felt the cold press of something sharp against his neck. A voice low, eerily calm whispered from behind him. "I did." Richard froze. The grip on his shoulder tightened, pressing the blade closer to his skin. And then slowly, the figure stepped forward, revealing himself. Daniel. The air was sucked from Richard's lungs. His own son stood before him, his eyes dark with something unreadable. Not fear, not panic, something else. Something far worse. Richard's mind couldn't process what he was seeing, what it meant. "Daniel." His voice was barely a whisper. "What are you doing?" Daniel tilted his head, watching him the way a predator watches its prey. "You really don't get it, do you?" His voice was almost amused. "You've been chasing ghosts, looking in all the wrong places. And the whole time, I was standing right in front of you." Richard's stomach twisted. The affair, the threats, the missing evidence. Had it all been a distraction? A game? He had been searching for answers, believing he was the one uncovering the truth. But the truth had been staring him in the face all along. And it had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Richard's entire world had just tilted on its axis, leaving him trapped in a moment he couldn't escape. His own son, his flesh and blood, stood before him, a knife pressed to his throat, his voice laced with a quiet amusement that sent ice down Richard's spine. Daniel wasn't afraid. He wasn't desperate or panicked. He was in control, and that realization made everything worse. For a split second, Richard considered the possibility that this was some kind of mistake, that Daniel had been coerced, that someone had forced his hand. But one look into his son's eyes shattered that hope. There was no hesitation, no guilt, just cold calculation. "Daniel," Richard murmured, trying to keep his voice steady, "you don't have to do this." He didn't dare move, didn't dare provoke him. The weight of the blade against his skin was too real, too close. "Tell me what's going on. We can fix this." Daniel let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You really are clueless, aren't you?" His grip tightened on the knife, but he didn't press down, at least, not yet. "You've spent all this time chasing after Claire, digging through the past, convinced this was all about some affair." He leaned in slightly, his breath cold against Richard's face. "But you never stopped to think maybe the biggest betrayal wasn't hers." Richard felt his stomach knot. "What are you talking about?" His mind raced through every memory, every moment that had led up to this. He had believed Claire and Daniel were keeping secrets from him. And they had been. But now he realized there was something much larger at play, something he had missed entirely. A low, pained groan from behind them made Richard glance over Daniel's shoulder. Claire was still slumped against the counter, struggling to push herself upright. Her face was pale, her breath shallow, but her eyes were locked onto Daniel with something between horror and heartbreak. "Daniel," she rasped, her voice weak but desperate. "Stop this. You don't understand what you're doing." Daniel barely spared her a glance. "I understand perfectly," he said, his voice sharp, unwavering. "Unlike the two of you, I've always seen things for what they really are." His gaze flicked back to Richard, studying him as if waiting for him to piece it all together. "Come on, Dad. You've always been so good at finding the truth. So tell me, what did you miss?" Richard's pulse thundered in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to do something, to disarm Daniel, to take control. But he knew if he moved too soon, one wrong step could end in bloodshed. He had to think. What had he missed? What was Daniel trying to tell him? He ran through the past few weeks in his mind, the threatening messages, the missing evidence, Michael's disappearance. And then, the realization struck him like a freight train. Michael. Richard's throat went dry. The messages, the warnings, they had come after he involved Michael. After he had confided in him, shared his suspicions. What if Michael hadn't just been an innocent bystander? What if... You told him, didn't you? Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper, but the accusation in it was deafening. You ran to him the second you thought something was wrong. You trusted him more than your own son. His jaw clenched, and for the first time, Richard saw something flicker in his expression: hurt. Deep, cutting hurt. Richard's mind reeled. "Michael was my friend," he said carefully, watching Daniel's every move. "I thought I could trust him." Daniel let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Trust," he muttered under his breath. "That's funny." He took a step back, lowering the knife slightly, but not enough for Richard to make a move. "You have no idea who you let into your life, do you?" Richard felt a sickening weight settle in his chest. "Where is he, Daniel?" The words felt heavy on his tongue. He already knew the answer. He just wasn't ready to face it. Daniel's expression darkened, and for the first time, the mask slipped. "Gone," he said flatly, the way he should have been years ago. The room spun. Richard forced himself to stay upright, to keep his breathing steady. His own son had done something unforgivable. But why? What had Michael done to deserve this? What had Richard done? Claire let out a sharp breath, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Daniel, please." Her hands trembled as she tried to push herself up, but her body was too weak. "I know what he did to you. I know how much it hurt." Her voice broke slightly, the weight of whatever she wasn't saying crushing her. "But this isn't the way." Richard felt his heart stop. What he did? He looked between Claire and Daniel, his mind spinning. "What are you talking about?" Daniel's eyes burned with something raw and unspoken. And then, in the quietest, most damning voice, he said, "Michael wasn't your friend. He was your executioner." The room seemed to shrink. Richard couldn't breathe. He had spent so much time believing he was the one being hunted, that someone was after him. But what if the truth was far more twisted? What if he had never been the target at all? What if Daniel had spent years protecting him from something he never even saw coming? Richard felt like the floor beneath him had vanished, leaving him free-falling into an abyss of betrayal and unanswered questions. Michael wasn't his friend. He was his executioner. Daniel's words echoed in his skull, but they didn't make sense, not yet. His breathing was shallow, his pulse erratic. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael was a liar, a predator, a man who spent years weaving himself into our lives, waiting for the right moment to strike. Daniel's grip on the knife tightened, his knuckles turning white. "And you let him. You brought him in. You let him sit at our table. Let him watch us. Let him," he exhaled sharply, his jaw clenching. "You never even saw it." Richard's mind was a hurricane of denial and realization. Michael had been his closest friend for years, someone he trusted, confided in. But there was something in Daniel's eyes, something deeper than just anger. It was pain, a wound that had been festering for years, hidden beneath the surface, only now breaking open. Richard turned to Claire, searching for answers, but her expression was shattered, as if she had been holding on to a truth too heavy to bear. "Michael wasn't just your friend," she said, her voice shaking. "He was your shadow, and you were his target." The walls felt like they were closing in. "Target?" Richard repeated, his mind struggling to catch up. "Why? What did I do?" Claire swallowed hard, her body trembling. "It's not about what you did. It's about what you are." Before Richard could demand more, a sudden movement in the doorway sent his instincts into overdrive. A figure stepped inside, their silhouette sharp against the dim hallway light. At first, Richard thought it was another hallucination, another cruel trick of his spiraling mind. But then he saw the gun, and the man holding it. "Well," the voice drawled, smooth and deliberate, "looks like the family reunion's already started without me." Richard's blood turned to ice. He didn't need to see the face to recognize the voice. It was burned into his memory, buried beneath years of laughter, trust, and false friendship. Michael. His old friend stood there, completely at ease, as if this wasn't the moment where everything shattered. His fingers curled around the gun like it was an extension of himself, casual but lethal. His gaze drifted across the room, from Claire's bleeding form to Daniel's raised knife, before settling on Richard, and he smiled. "You always were a little slow, Rich," Michael mused, stepping forward. "I figured you'd piece it together by now, but I guess old habits die hard." His eyes flicked to Daniel, amused. At least the kid figured it out. Richard's heart pounded against his ribs. "Tell me," he said, his voice rough, raw. "Tell me what the hell is going on." Michael tilted his head, considering him like a specimen under glass. "You really want the truth?" He let out a soft chuckle. "Fine. Here it is." He took another step forward, lowering the gun slightly, not out of mercy, but out of control. He knew he had them cornered. "For the last 10 years, you've been living a lie, Richard. Your job, your family, your friendships, none of it was real. It was all carefully managed. Because the people I work for," he smiled, slow and sharp, "they've been waiting for you to outlive your usefulness." Richard felt his stomach drop. "Usefulness for what?" Michael raised an eyebrow. "You really don't know, do you?" He exhaled, almost disappointed. "That company you worked for, the one that mysteriously promoted you, gave you access to things you never questioned. They weren't just some corporation, Rich. They were a front, a machine designed to move money, influence, and power without leaving fingerprints. And you," he gestured at him, almost lazily, "were the perfect pawn. Loyal, predictable, and just smart enough to do your job without asking too many questions." Richard's head spun. His career, his entire life had been a setup, a carefully orchestrated lie. The weight of it crashed down on him, suffocating. "You used me," he said, the words bitter in his mouth. Michael smirked. "Of course we did. And you made it so easy." His gaze darkened. "But then you started digging. You started asking questions. You got too curious. And suddenly, you weren't a pawn anymore. You were a liability." Everything made sense now. The threats, the missing evidence, the warnings to stop digging. This wasn't just about Claire's affair. This wasn't about jealousy, betrayal, or family secrets. This was bigger. Much, much bigger. And then, the lights cut out. A second later, the deafening sound of a gunshot ripped through the darkness. The gunshot tore through the suffocating darkness, its echo bouncing off the walls like a violent scream. Richard's body tensed, expecting the searing pain of a bullet. But instead, there was silence, then movement. Heavy footsteps. A strangled gasp. The metallic clang of something hitting the floor. Then, just as quickly as the shot had come, The power flickered back on. Richard's breath caught in his throat. Michael was on the ground, his gun skidding across the floor, his hand clutching his shoulder where fresh blood bloomed through his shirt. His cocky smirk was gone, replaced with something sharper: pain, shock, and just a hint of rage. Standing over him, gun in hand, was Daniel. The boy's face was blank, unreadable, but his hands trembled, the weight of what he had done settling into his bones. His gaze flicked to Richard, as if looking for reassurance, but before anyone could speak, Michael let out a rasping chuckle, his breath uneven. "You really are your father's son," he muttered, teeth gritted against the pain. Always jumping the gun. Daniel's grip tightened on the weapon, but Richard could see the hesitation. The battle raging inside him. Michael wasn't just some faceless enemy. He was someone who had been in their lives for years, a constant presence, a trusted friend turned monster. Killing him wasn't just about survival, it was about severing a tie that had been tangled into their family's history. And Michael knew it. He was playing into it. Richard moved fast, kicking the fallen gun away, before crouching beside Daniel, gently wrapping a hand around his wrist. "You don't have to do this," he said softly, barely above a whisper. "It's over." Daniel didn't look at him, his gaze locked on Michael. "Is it?" His voice wavered slightly, but there was something cold beneath it. "He just said it himself. He's following orders. That means there's more of them. More people waiting for the chance to finish what he started." Michael let out a low, strained laugh. Smart kid. His fingers pressed against his bleeding shoulder, his breathing labored but steady. "You think this ends with me? You think I'm the worst of them?" He coughed, a dark stain appearing at the corner of his lips. "I was just the middleman. The real power? You don't even know their names. You can't stop them." Richard's stomach twisted. He wanted to believe Michael was bluffing, but deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't just about Michael. He was part of something bigger, something that had manipulated Richard's entire life. Claire let out a sharp breath from across the room, struggling to sit upright. "Then let's make sure they know we're not afraid." Her voice was weak, but fierce, a fire reigniting in her eyes. She turned to Daniel. "Don't let him control you the way he controlled your father." Daniel's fingers flexed around the gun. His entire life had been shaped by lies, by men like Michael pulling strings from the shadows. But here now, in this moment, he had the power. He could choose who he became. Slowly, carefully, he lowered the weapon. Michael smirked, but there was something almost approving in his eyes, as if he had expected this outcome all along. "Good choice," he murmured, his voice growing fainter. "But it won't matter. They'll come for you. They always do." Richard took a deep breath, the weight of everything crashing into him. His job, his family, his entire reality had been a carefully constructed illusion, and now that it had cracked, there was no going back. He had been played for years, and the only way to survive was to finally become the man they didn't expect. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone, Claire, maybe, had called for help, but Richard knew this wasn't over. As the first flash of red and blue lights painted the walls, Michael let out one final breath, his smirk never fading. And in that last moment, as his body finally stilled, Richard knew the real fight was just beginning. Create a series of dark, suspenseful, and cinematic images for a thriller story titled "Father Murders Son" after discovering his affair with Stepmom. Depict a tense, atmospheric setting with moody lighting and deep shadows. Show a powerful, middle-aged father with a menacing expression, gripping a gun tightly in a dimly lit room. Include a younger man, his son, with fear in his eyes, standing defensively, while a beautiful yet conflicted woman, the stepmother, watches from the background, torn between guilt and fear. Illustrate a dramatic confrontation, maybe the father pointing the gun at his son, or the stepmother desperately trying to intervene. Later, capture moments of chaos: blood on the floor, flashing police lights outside a mansion, and a mysterious figure lurking in the shadows, hinting at a deeper conspiracy.